Somewhere around 2 in the morning, a casino starts to feel different. Not louder, strangely enough, quieter. And if you sit there long enough, a curious thought begins to creep in. None of this feels accidental. Why does this place never seem to be in much of a hurry? The crowds thin out, the slot machines keep humming, and the whole place settles into a rhythm that feels almost peaceful. Cards slide across felt, chips stack and unstack. A machine somewhere rings out like it just hit a fortune, but anyone close enough can tell it probably paid about $12. Something about this place feels comfortable, a little too comfortable. And that's when you begin to notice something most people miss. The house is perfectly content as long as the chair stays warm. Because once you understand how casinos really win, the whole place starts to look different. The drinks arrive without asking. The lights never change. Time behaves differently in there, like it's been politely asked to wait outside. And the games themselves, well, they have a way of keeping you seated. Not in an aggressive way, nothing that feels like pressure, just a gentle suggestion. One more hand. One more spin. One more. Now, a person could sit at a blackjack table for a few hours and walk away believing they'd had a decent night. Maybe they won a little. Maybe they lost a little. But they stayed. And that, as it turns out, is the only part that really matters. The games get all the attention, but the real muscle in a casino is patience. You might imagine the house sitting there waiting for one dramatic collapse, chips disappearing in a bad hand, the sort of disaster gamblers talk about for years. But casinos learned something a long time ago. People remember nights like that. They tell their friends, and the next weekend, they stay home. A volatile variable, that's what they call them. So the house rarely chases a knockout. It prefers something quieter. A player who loses slowly tends to wander back. They want you leaving with enough gas in the tank to come back tomorrow. That reminds me of an old line that drifts around poker rooms and smoky bars out in Nevada. You'll hear it from dealers, old gamblers, the sort of fellas who spent half their life staring at green felt. It goes something like this. The casino doesn't want your last dollar tonight. It wants you comfortable enough to bring it back tomorrow, and the night after that, and the night after that. That idea, simple as it sounds, turns out to be the whole cogwheel running the strip. Luck gets the spotlight, skill gets the arguments, but time quietly runs the place. Now, somewhere along the line, a few bright fellas with calculators started studying these games. Folks at universities, statisticians, the kind of people who enjoy arguing with probability. And every one of them eventually stumbles onto the same quiet advantage hiding underneath the games. The house edge. At blackjack, played carefully, the casino might hold something like 0.5%, maybe a little more depending on the table rules. That's assuming the player follows basic strategy, and not whatever advice the fellow at the bar is handing out. Slots tend to run higher, 5%, sometimes 10. Those numbers don't look like much sitting on paper, almost polite. But mathematics has a funny personality. Give it enough time, and it always collects. And that's where the quiet tug of war begins. The dealer isn't really the one you're playing against. The real contest begins between two things that start drifting apart the moment you sit down. Your money and your time. One is bound to run out faster. And casinos have spent the better part of a century designing their games so that players rarely feel the moment when those two things start slipping away from each other. The trick is subtle. You lose, but slowly. Imagine losing $100 in a single hand. That stings. You feel it in your chest. You start doing mental math about the drive home and the money you probably should have spent on groceries instead. Most people get up after a loss like that. They need air. Now imagine losing that same $100 20 cents at a time, spread across an hour, maybe two. In between those small losses, you hit a few little wins. Nothing life-changing. $10 here, $12 there. The machine flashes. It sings. You feel a tiny pulse of satisfaction. By the time the $100 disappears, it hardly feels like it disappeared at all. It just drifted off somewhere, like loose change slipping through a hole in your pocket. Game designers know this well. Entire machines are built around the idea. Slot machines are masters of a very particular trick. They make losing feel manageable. You feed in a bill, you start spinning, and the machine returns little bits of your money back to you in a rhythm that keeps the experience alive. Not too fast, not too slow, just enough to keep the chair warm. After a while, something interesting begins to happen inside the brain. People stop thinking about money in totals. They start thinking in moments. A win, a spin, a near win, another spin. I've watched people sit at machines for 2-3 hours and then describe themselves as having broken even, when what they meant was they'd been down $200, hit a bonus round, come back to down 80, and called that even. The baseline had moved. They'd recalibrated without noticing, and they almost cracked the major jackpot in the process. Which brings us to one of the stranger little details inside modern slot machines: the near miss. You've probably seen one. 2 jackpot symbols line up. The third slides just past the pay line and stops. So close. For a moment, your brain reacts almost exactly the same way it would have if the jackpot had landed. That's not speculation either. A few curious scientists over at Cambridge ran some experiments on this years ago. Hooked gamblers up to brain scanners, watched what happened when those reels stopped just short of a jackpot. And sure enough, the brain lit up almost the same way it would if the win had actually landed. Which is remarkable when you think about it, because in the cold language of probability, a near miss is just a loss dressed up for Sunday supper. Slot designers understand this very well. They program reels so that near misses appear just often enough to keep players leaning forward. Not suspiciously often, just enough to stir the imagination. The machine whispers the same thing every gambler has heard at least once in their life. You almost had it, bud. Try again. On a digital machine, a reel stopping 1 notch above the jackpot isn't any different than it stopping on a lemon or a blank space. The outcome was decided the millisecond you hit the button by a random number generator tucked away inside the machine. But to the human eye, it looks like a tragedy in 3 acts. Why would the house do this? Because gamblers have a long tradition of believing in momentum. Hot streaks, cold streaks, lucky chairs, lucky shirts. There's a man somewhere in Nevada right now who refuses to sit down at a blackjack table unless he's wearing the same hat he wore during a good night in 1997. I met him once. Nice fella. Swore that the hat knew more about blackjack than he did. Then he hit a 20, and suddenly the hat had a strong argument. The casino, of course, does not argue with these beliefs. Why would it? A hopeful player tends to stay longer than a discouraged one, and staying longer brings us to another quiet trick. Some slot machines celebrate wins that aren't actually wins. Let's say you bet $1 on a spin. The reels stop, and the machine returns 50 cents. Mathematically, you've lost half your bet. But the machine lights up anyway. Music plays. The screen flashes bright colors. In casino language, this is called a loss disguised as a win. A few researchers who study these machines started noticing something funny. They sat beside players for hours, quietly tracking the spins, and what they saw kept repeating itself. The machine celebrates just often enough that the night starts to feel lively, even when a spin has still taken money off the table. It created a strange illusion. Players remembered the excitement, but not the arithmetic. Casinos didn't invent this sort of psychology. They just learned how to make a living off it. Human beings have always responded strongly to uncertain rewards. Back in the 1950s, a psychologist named B.F. Skinner ran a strange little experiment with pigeons. He built a box and put a lever inside. Every so often, when a pigeon pecked the lever, a food pellet dropped out. Not every time, just sometimes. Pretty soon, those pigeons were pecking that lever like their lives depended on it. Turns out pigeons aren't so different from gamblers. The randomness made the behavior stronger, not weaker. That same principle sits inside nearly every gambling game on Earth. It's called a variable reward schedule. The brain begins expecting the next reward at any moment. Maybe the next spin, maybe the next hand, maybe the one after that. And while the player waits for that moment, time begins to behave strangely again. Casinos are famously difficult places to measure time. Walk across a casino floor and try to find a clock. You'll be looking a while. It's a bit of a cliché by now, but there's a reason for it. Places like this are built to remove the little signals that tell a person it might be time to stand up and leave. Windows are also rare. Natural light even rarer. The lighting remains almost perfectly consistent. Morning feels like evening. Evening feels like midnight. Midnight feels like, well, whatever the casino decides midnight should feel like. Roger Thomas, who helped design parts of the Bellagio and the Mirage in Las Vegas during the 1990s, once explained that casinos carefully manage visual cues that might remind players how long they've been sitting. Just about everything in a casino is arranged with that same idea in mind. And yes, before someone asks, even the carpet. Just take a look at most casino floors. They're usually a riot of chaotic patterns, swirling purples and garish oranges. The patterns are loud enough that your eyes don't linger there long. They drift upward, toward the machines, toward the action. There was a story floating around Las Vegas about a blackjack player who sat down for what he thought would be a quick session sometime late one evening. He ordered a drink, played a few hands, then another few. The dealer rotated out, then another dealer, then another. At some point, a cocktail waitress leaned down and said something that startled him. "Sir, breakfast?" The man looked around the casino floor. The lighting hadn't changed. The music sounded the same. But somewhere beyond those walls, the sun had come up. He'd been playing for nearly 10 hours. And that's when the mathematics quietly starts doing its work. And this is the part most gamblers never notice, because the house edge doesn't need drama. It doesn't need luck. It simply needs time. Every spin, every hand, every roll of the dice nudges the probability just slightly toward the house. 1% here, 5% there, tiny fractions of advantage repeating thousands of times. Players often imagine gambling as a contest between themselves and the casino, but that's not quite accurate. The casino isn't competing against the player in any personal sense. It's cooperating with probability. And probability is a very patient partner. The longer the game continues, the more predictable the outcome becomes. Not on any single spin, not on any single hand, but across time. Which brings us back to that quiet design principle hiding beneath the noise and neon. A defeated player leaves. A comfortable player stays. Casinos understand something about human nature that card players and gamblers have been discovering for centuries. People will tolerate a slow leak far longer than a sudden drop. A slow leak blends into the rhythm of the night. It becomes part of the evening, part of the story, and gamblers love stories. Ask anyone who spends enough time around poker tables, the sort of tales folks might call legends of the felt. Eventually, you'll hear about the night someone was one card away from a miracle, or the spin that almost landed the jackpot, or the dealer who somehow kept pulling 21s like it was part of the job description. Those stories live in the mind far longer than the quiet arithmetic that came afterward. Now, none of this makes casinos sinister places. In fact, most of the time, they're exactly what they appear to be: entertainment, bright lights, a little risk, a little excitement, a chance to flirt with luck for a few hours. But underneath the noise, there's an elegant machine humming along, a system built carefully over decades. Engineers, psychologists, game designers, architects, all nudging the experience in the same direction, toward comfort, toward anticipation, toward one more spin. And if you sit long enough at a quiet table late at night, you might begin to notice it, not as something threatening, just something patient. The cards slide across the felt. The chips stack and unstack. A slot machine somewhere rings out in celebration, and the whole place keeps moving at its own steady pace. Probability always shows up eventually, usually right around the time the player decides to stay a little longer. And it never seems to be in much of a hurry. So the games continue. The chairs stay warm. The lights stay bright. The house understands something gamblers usually learn the hard way. The next card doesn't have to change your life. It just has to be interesting enough to make you wait for the one after it. And casinos? Well, they've got all the time in the world. There are plenty more stories hiding under those lights, some louder than others. If you're still here, pull up a chair. The felt's still warm.